He didn't ask, he demanded. The word move snapped through the boardroom like a ruler against glass. Every executive froze. Every assistant suddenly remembered they had notes to look at, screens to scroll through, anything but witness what was happening. At the head of the table sat Dr. Leona Harris, founder and CEO of Linatech Systems, the woman leading the $700 million merger that everyone in the room had been waiting months to close. She had arrived early, reviewed every clause twice, and taken the seat assigned to her, one marked clearly with her name. But none of that mattered to Edward Langston, the white executive who had just walked in as if the entire floor belonged to his family's legacy. He stopped behind her chair, close enough that his cologne mingled with the hum of the air conditioning. His tone wasn't loud. It was entitled, the kind of tone that assumed obedience. "Did you not hear me?" he said again. "You're in my seat." Leona looked up slowly, meeting his eyes, calm, controlled, no apology, no reaction. She simply said, "You must be mistaken." A ripple passed through the room, short, nervous, invisible. Someone coughed. Another pretended to check a document. Everyone knew what this was. It wasn't about seating. It was about ownership. Edward smirked, that smug half-smile people wear when they believe the world still answers to their surname. "That chair," he said, tapping its back lightly, "is for the executive principal. I've been sitting there for the past 6 years." "And yet," she replied, turning one page of her folder, "today it has my name on it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The way she said "my" carried more weight than his entire title. For the first time, Edward blinked. The composure on her face unsettled him. He wasn't used to stillness that strong. He chuckled under his breath as if she'd made a joke. "Look, no need to make this awkward. Why don't you take a seat over there?" He gestured toward the far corner, one of the side chairs used by assistants and observers. Nobody dared breathe too loudly. Leona closed her folder. "You want me to move from my assigned seat to yours?" "Yes," he said. "That would be best, for everyone." It wasn't just arrogance, it was inheritance speaking. Years of unchallenged power wearing an expensive suit. For a heartbeat, silence thickened. Then, with a slow grace, Leona pushed her chair back. Not to yield, but to rise. Every eye followed her as she stood. She wasn't tall, but in that moment she seemed to tower. "Tell me," she said softly, "do you believe position defines competence, or competence defines position?" He frowned, unsure whether she was insulting him or giving him a test. "Because if you believe it's the chair that gives you value," she continued, "then you're right to be afraid of losing it." The entire room stilled again. One of the junior lawyer's pens fell to the table. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should have. Edward's face flushed, but he forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You've got spirit," he muttered. "That's cute. Cute." A word she'd heard her entire career, when her achievements were too large to ignore, but too inconvenient to credit. She sat back down, in the same seat, slowly, deliberately. The scrape of her chair against the floor might as well have been thunder. That was when Edward's confidence cracked. "You really don't know who you're talking to," he said, voice lowering. Leona lifted her gaze. "No," she said, "you really don't know who you're talking to." A few heads turned. Even those who had stayed silent felt something shift, small but seismic. The projector light blinked on, reflecting off the silver logo embossed on her folder. Her finger hovered over the laptop's trackpad. Whatever came next, no one in that room was ready for it. If stories like this remind you that silence is never weakness, hit subscribe now. And before the next part begins, drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far voices like this can travel. The next sound wasn't Edward's voice. It was the click of a file loading on screen. Charts, numbers, dates, and within 3 minutes, one man's entire empire was about to collapse because of the woman he told to move. Long before she ever sat at that polished boardroom table, Leona Harris learned what it meant to build something from nothing. She was born in Atlanta's South Side, in a one-bedroom apartment with cracked ceilings and a window that rattled when trucks rolled past. Her mother, Denise Harris, worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices by day and stacking shelves at night, so her daughter could dream in peace. There were no trust funds, no private tutors, just a second-hand laptop that ran more on prayer than on power. While other kids played outside, Leona sat by that flickering screen, teaching herself code line by line. HTML first, then Python, then anything else the slow internet could teach her. The laptop wasn't hers. It belonged to her neighbor's son, and she could only use it after his homework was done. Most nights, that meant staying up past midnight, typing with freezing fingers and burning eyes. Her school was the kind of place people forgot existed. Broken lockers, torn textbooks, teachers too tired to notice brilliance when it sat in the back row. But Leona noticed herself. She didn't wait for recognition. She built it, quietly. At 14, she entered her first state coding competition. Her mother couldn't afford the registration fee, so Leona washed cars and sold lemonade for a week straight. She showed up in thrift store shoes and a borrowed blazer. Every other contestant wore badges from private academies. She wore resilience. When the results were announced, she placed first, by a margin so wide the judges double-checked her code for plagiarism. They couldn't believe a black girl from her zip code could write algorithms cleaner than theirs. That moment should have changed everything. It didn't. College counselors told her to aim lower. Recruiters praised her as articulate. Scholarships came with strings, internships with ceilings. Still, she pushed through. Spelman College for undergrad, Harvard for her MBA. Each place brought new lessons about excellence and invisibility, how to be the best and still be underestimated, how to smile when called inspiring by people who never saw her as equal. By 32, Leona had founded Linatech Systems, a company that used artificial intelligence to predict climate risks and protect urban communities from flooding and heat waves. She wasn't just building software, she was building survival. Her technology was adopted in 6 states, saving millions in potential damage. Investors called her a visionary. The press called her the first black woman to lead a climate tech firm valued over $2 billion. That headline always came with the same sting. First black woman. Like her worth existed only in comparison. Like her skin tone was a disclaimer for her genius. At award ceremonies, she noticed how their applause softened when she stepped on stage. At conferences, she saw panels filled with men quoting her ideas without credit. She learned that dignity, for someone like her, wasn't just worn, it was defended. Every smile was armor. Every sentence had to be weighed, polished, proofread in real time. Because one misstep from her wasn't just a mistake, it was a stereotype waiting to be confirmed. She kept her tone steady, her hair natural, her wardrobe neutral, muted grays and soft blues. No jewelry that flashed too much, no heels that clicked too loud. In boardrooms, confidence had to sound calm, not confrontational. People mistook her silence for softness. They were wrong. Leona had learned that sometimes silence was a strategy. There were nights when exhaustion whispered, "Why keep fighting a system that won't bend?" But every time that thought came, she'd remember her mother's hands, cracked from bleach, trembling as she handed Leona her first business card. "Make them remember your name for what you build, not what they break," she'd said. Linatech kept growing. Her staff tripled. Partnerships expanded across Europe. Yet behind every success, there was always that quiet resistance she could feel in the air. A board member's raised brow when she entered, a paused handshake at corporate dinners, a subtle glance toward the assistant when she spoke too decisively. She didn't chase acceptance anymore. She chased results. Because results made silence uncomfortable. And on that morning, the one that led to the boardroom, she thought it was just another meeting, another chance to prove her worth in a world still reluctant to admit it. She reviewed her presentation twice, drank her green tea, and straightened the folder marked Confidential, Merger Approval. Linatech x Orion Group. What she didn't know was that behind those glass walls, a storm was waiting. Not the kind you prepare for, but the kind that tests what you're truly made of. When she walked into that boardroom, calm and ready, she wasn't just carrying numbers and contracts. She was carrying generations of restraint, grace, and grit. And the man who would tell her to move had no idea that the woman sitting in his chair had spent her entire life fighting for the right to sit there. Before Edward Langston ever opened his mouth in that boardroom, the room had already been built for him. His name wasn't just on the company letterhead. It was woven into the carpet, stamped on the foundation, echoed in every hallway of the Langston Tower in Lower Manhattan. He was the grandson of Harold Langston, the man who'd built Orion Group an aviation and infrastructure empire that supplied half the country's private terminals. His father, Charles Langston, expanded it into global contracts, embedding the family's name into airports, rail systems, and government deals. Edward inherited all of it, except humility. He grew up in homes that looked like museums, surrounded by portraits of pale men staring down from gold frames. Every dinner was a lesson in dominance, every conversation about legacy. Remember, his father used to tell him, Langstons don't ask for seats. They own the table. And Edward believed it. He attended schools where everyone already knew his last name. Professors who wanted funding gave him grades he didn't earn. Board members who wanted favor laughed at jokes that weren't funny. He learned early that confidence could replace competence, if your signature carried weight. So when the company announced a joint venture meeting with a new firm, and he saw Dr. Leona Harris listed as principal negotiator, his reaction wasn't curiosity, it was irritation. A woman? A black woman? In my seat? He didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. That kind of bias doesn't always come with a slur. It hides behind smiles, tone, and professional concerns. Edward's version of racism was sophisticated, polished, almost polite. He called it standards. He told himself he just preferred familiarity in leadership. What he meant was people who looked like him, thought like him, and could afford the same golf club membership. When Leona's name appeared in internal memos, his first thought was optics. A diversity success story, a PR move to appease investors, a headline meant to show inclusion without real power behind it. He skimmed her profile, saw Harvard MBA, and scoffed. They all run to the Ivy League to legitimize themselves. He didn't bother to notice her patents, her company's valuation, or her record-breaking government contracts. He didn't even care that her technology had prevented infrastructure collapses in 2 major cities. He just couldn't process the idea that someone like her could walk into his inherited kingdom and speak as an equal. In his mind, her presence was temporary. Tokenism had an expiration date. Edward's confidence was the kind that came from never being told no. Every project he'd overseen had been inherited from men who cleaned up his mistakes quietly. His failures were covered in press statements about unforeseen market conditions. His incompetence was called bold leadership. The staff knew. They always did. But they also knew what happened to those who challenged him. Careers vanished. Transfers appeared overnight. Performance reviews mysteriously plummeted. To Edward, it wasn't abuse, it was maintenance. The system worked because people knew their place. And the higher he climbed, the more he believed he was protecting order. When he walked into that boardroom, late as always, his stride wasn't rushed. Men like him didn't hurry. He loosened his tie, ignored greetings, and scanned the room with the bored confidence of a man convinced he owned the oxygen. And then he saw her, sitting at his seat, calm, composed, not fidgeting, not apologizing, just there, as if she belonged. For Edward, that was an offense, not the kind that breaks laws, but the kind that bruises entitlement. He stopped behind her chair, waiting for her to look up. She didn't. That was strike 1. He demanded she move. She didn't. Strike 2. Every inch of him itched for dominance, to reclaim the hierarchy he believed she disrupted by simply existing where she wasn't supposed to be. As she spoke, measured, professional, unbothered, he heard nothing she said. His mind filtered her calm as arrogance, her posture as defiance. He told himself she was emotional beneath the surface, that she'd eventually crack. He didn't realize he was the one cracking. Edward had built his identity on unearned authority. But authority without merit is fragile. It shakes when met with quiet strength. And Leona Harris, with her poise and silence, was shaking the ground he'd always stood on. Every word she said without raising her voice was a mirror, reflecting everything he wasn't. Earned respect, not inherited privilege. He thought this meeting was about control. He didn't know it would become his undoing. Because arrogance always believes it's untouchable, until it collides with evidence. The boardroom was too quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows sound and leaves only breath. Edward Langston stood behind Leona's chair again, his hands on the backrest like he was staking a claim. The audacity in his posture was louder than any outburst could have been. The meeting hadn't even started, yet everyone already knew this wasn't going to be about numbers. It was going to be about power. Move, he said again. this time louder, sharper, deliberate enough for the room to hear. The words hung there, offensive not for what they meant, but for what they assumed. Across the table, one of the senior partners blinked rapidly and looked down at his tablet. Another executive twisted her wedding ring, pretending to be deeply fascinated by her notes. No one spoke. The intern by the coffee machine froze mid-pour, eyes darting between them like a spectator at the edge of a collision. Leona didn't answer right away. She took a slow breath, her fingers resting on the folder in front of her. Her composure didn't waver, not even an inch. That's what unnerved him the most. Edward's jaw tightened. "I said move. That seat's mine, always has been." She turned her head slightly, eyes meeting his. "And yet," she said calmly, "the document on your desk says otherwise." He frowned, confused, until she reached for the small remote beside her folder and clicked once. The projector screen came to life with a soft hum. Up flashed a seating chart. Every name, every role, every assigned position approved by the executive board. And there, printed in black and white, next to Chief Negotiator, Orion Group Partnership, Dr. Leona Harris. The evidence glowed against the wall for everyone to see. Edward's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "That's an error," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "Whoever prepared this doesn't understand hierarchy." Leona didn't flinch. "You mean the hierarchy where you decide what's correct?" A few heads lifted. Someone coughed just to fill the air. Edward leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to be missed. "You people love rules until they inconvenience you." There it was, casual, venomous, intentional. The kind of racism that slithers under professionalism. Not shouted, just whispered between spreadsheets and smiles. Leona's hand paused mid-page. She exhaled slowly. The air around her shifted, not in anger but in authority. "You're out of position," she said quietly, "in more ways than one." That line landed like a strike. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise. The kind of truth that leaves no room for rebuttal. Edward blinked. For the first time he didn't know what to say. His confidence stumbled, and everyone felt it. Still, he couldn't let go of control. He forced another grin, leaning even closer until his shadow fell across her papers. "You think one promotion changes what this room is?" he murmured. "It's still ours." Her pen rolled off the table and hit the floor. She didn't bend to pick it up. She just looked at him with an expression that could silence a crowd. "Funny," she said softly. "You sound like a man trying to convince himself he still matters." The words cut deeper than he expected. His smirk twitched, the muscles in his cheek tightening. He stepped back, masking his irritation behind a scoff. But the damage was done. The power he thought he held had shifted. Everyone in that room could feel it. The CFO cleared his throat, trying to rescue the tension. "Perhaps we can begin," Edward interrupted. "Not until she moves." The CFO froze. The HR director looked at the floor. The silence returned, heavy again. Leona slowly rose to her feet, not to give in, but to face him fully. "You want this seat so badly," she said, her voice calm enough to chill the room. "You can have it. But before you sit down, you should probably see what you've been hiding under it." Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim silver USB drive. The logo of her company, Linatech Systems, glinted faintly in the boardroom light. Edward's smirk returned, though thinner now. "What are you trying to prove?" She slid the USB into the projector console. "That the truth doesn't need permission to enter a room." A soft chime echoed as the system detected the drive. The projector blinked again, ready to display whatever came next. Edward's shoulders stiffened. The others shifted nervously in their seats, sensing something far bigger than a seating dispute was about to surface. Leona's fingers hovered over the trackpad. Her voice remained level, her tone almost conversational. "For years you've mistaken silence for submission," she said. "Let's correct that misunderstanding." Then, with one small click, the screen began to change. Charts, numbers, contracts, audit reports. And as the first slide appeared, the color drained from Edward Langston's face. What filled that screen wasn't an argument. It was evidence. And in that instant, every person in the room understood. The meeting they thought they were attending had just turned into a reckoning. The projector hummed softly, an ordinary sound before an extraordinary reckoning. The first slide flashed onto the wall. A spreadsheet filled with names, dates, and payment logs. Nothing dramatic at first glance, but the numbers told a story, one of missing funds, duplicated invoices, and vendors that didn't exist. Leona stood at the head of the table, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each click of her remote landed like a gavel. "These are transactions approved by your office, Mr. Langston," she began. "Over the last 9 months, Orion Group authorized vendor payouts totaling $4.6 million, none of which have been verified." Edward's face twitched. He forced a scoff. "You're reaching. Those are department-level authorizations." Leona clicked again. The next slide zoomed in on digital signatures, his name on every single one. Gasps rippled through the room. One of the executives shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, while another ran a finger around his collar as if the air had suddenly grown heavy. The CFO's pen stopped moving. Even the intern at the coffee station stood still, mug halfway to his lips. Leona kept going. No hesitation, no cruelty, just truth. "Here," she said, pointing to the chart, "are the offshore accounts these funds were traced to. Registered under a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Beneficiary listed as E. Langston Holdings." Edward's jaw slackened. His hands, once confidently placed on the table, curled into fists. "You can't," he started. "I already did," she interrupted. No anger, no theatrics, just finality. Another click. A slide showing screenshots of emails, his correspondence with a supplier flagged by compliance. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the missing transactions. Leona spoke evenly, each word measured like she'd rehearsed it for this exact moment. "While the board debated merger terms, your division buried losses. You didn't just hide debt, you disguised it as growth." Edward stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. "You have no right to." She met his outburst with silence, the kind that stripped every excuse from his mouth. "Sit down, Edward," the CFO muttered quietly, not looking at him. Edward froze. For the first time in his career, authority wasn't echoing his name, it was closing in around it. Leona continued, eyes steady. "This is why I'm here. My firm's analytics uncovered the discrepancies while assessing your merger documents. You wanted to know if I belonged in this seat." She paused. "Now you do." Her words landed with precision, each syllable clean, sharp, deliberate. At that moment, the door opened. 2 men in security uniforms entered, accompanied by the company's compliance officer. No one had called them. Leona had already arranged it before the meeting began. Edward spun toward them. "This is ridiculous. I built this company." One of the security guards spoke calmly. "Sir, you've been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. You'll need to surrender your access badge and leave the premises." The room was so silent the only sound was the soft buzz of the projector. Edward's voice cracked between rage and disbelief. "You think you can humiliate me?" Leona finally looked up from her laptop. "You did that yourself." For 3 minutes, exactly 180 seconds, Leona Harris took everything he used to intimidate her and turned it into evidence. As Edward was led toward the door, his reflection flashed across the projector screen, his legacy collapsing behind him in numbers and truth. When the door closed, no one moved. Not a word. Not a breath, just the sound of the projector powering down. Leona unplugged the USB drive, slid it back into her bag, and straightened her folder. Her face remained calm, but the room knew it wasn't quiet because they respected her. It was quiet because they finally saw her. In those 3 minutes, she didn't just keep her seat, she dismantled his throne. No one in that boardroom spoke for a long time after Edward Langston was escorted out. The air was thick with something heavier than shame, truth. Every person who had stayed silent when he demanded Leona move now stared at the space where he'd stood, not realizing silence had made them accomplices. The projector was off, the lights had dimmed, yet the echoes of those 3 minutes lingered. Leona gathered her papers quietly, not in triumph, but in resolve. She didn't look at anyone on her way out. She didn't need to. Her calm had already said everything words could not. What she didn't know was that someone had recorded it. A junior assistant seated near the wall, trembling behind her tablet, had hit the voice memo app the moment Edward shouted, "Move." She hadn't meant to expose anyone. She just wanted proof. Proof that she wasn't imagining how black women were treated in those rooms. Proof that she wasn't crazy to feel fear when people like him raised their voices. That 58-second clip changed everything. It started small. An anonymous post on a professional forum. What happens when a black woman refuses to give up her seat at the table? Then came the link. Audio only. The unmistakable command, move. Followed by the silence. Then Leona's steady voice, you're out of position in more ways than one. It spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, the clip had been uploaded to Twitter, then TikTok, then LinkedIn. The caption read, "This is how black women get treated in boardrooms." Hashtags multiplied. She belongs here, corporate racism, the seat matters. Women across the country commented, I've heard that tone. I've lived that pause. Others wrote, I've been her. By morning, the clip had reached 1 million views. By afternoon, every major business outlet had picked it up, but they changed the headline. High-profile executive clash sparks internal investigation. Not a word about race, not a word about the real story. They framed it as a communication dispute, a personality clash, a professional misunderstanding. The same system that had erased her voice in that boardroom tried to dilute it again in public. But the internet refused to let that happen. People reposted the clip with new captions. Call it what it is. This wasn't a disagreement. It was racism in a suit. They sanitized the story, will restore the truth. And just like that, the story evolved from one company's embarrassment to a cultural reckoning. Podcasts dissected the tone of Edward's voice. Legal analysts discussed racial bias in corporate investigations. Activists wrote op-eds demanding accountability. And under every post, the same quote trended. Sometimes standing up means staying seated. Leona stayed silent through it all. No tweets, no interviews, no statements. Her PR team begged her to respond. She didn't. She understood something they didn't. The world already had enough noise. Her silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was power. The company, meanwhile, panicked. HR departments scrambled. Internal emails leaked. Apologies, legal drafts, statements being revised and rephrased to sound inclusive. But nothing could contain the narrative now. Because what happened in that boardroom wasn't an isolated event. It was a reflection of every workplace where black women had to shrink themselves to survive. For every move shouted in public, there were hundreds whispered in closed doors. By day 3, journalists uncovered Edward's disciplinary history, memos ignored, complaints dismissed, women silenced. Those documents became public too. Each revelation tightened the noose around the culture that had protected him. Someone commented under the viral post, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." That line spread next. Billboards, tweets, even protest signs outside corporate offices. In the middle of all the chaos, Leona sat in her office at Linatech. The blinds were half open, the city stretching before her. Her assistant showed her the viral post on her phone. She read the comments quietly, smiled once, then handed it back. "Let them talk," she said softly. "They're saying what needed to be said." The world had finally found the words she didn't have to repeat. And though she hadn't planned it, hadn't recorded it, hadn't asked for it, the truth had escaped the boardroom and found its own voice. The silence she'd carried for years had broken, not with anger, but with proof. And from that moment on, no one could pretend they didn't hear it. By Monday morning, the glass tower that once symbolized authority looked more like a crime scene than a company. Reporters camped outside the revolving doors of Orion Group, microphones raised toward anyone wearing a badge. Investors were calling non-stop. Shareholders wanted explanations, not excuses. Inside, chaos hid behind professionalism. Emails titled Urgent Internal Review flooded inboxes. Compliance officers were now fixtures in hallways. Every executive who once laughed at Edward Langston's jokes was suddenly too busy to remember him. The board announced a temporary restructuring to restore public confidence. But everyone knew the truth. Orion was in free fall. Old files began to surface. HR logs stamped resolved, a word that had become meaningless. One dated back 4 years, a junior analyst describing Edward's pattern of condescension toward minority staff. Another noted verbal hostility during a diversity meeting. Each was closed with a familiar line, "No further action required." Now, those buried documents were being read aloud in conference rooms filled with lawyers and fear. The company's diversity officer, once sidelined, was suddenly treated like consultant for damage control. Departments that had never acknowledged race were now holding emergency listening sessions. It all felt hollow, performative but necessary for survival. Executives avoided eye contact in the cafeteria. The silence that had once protected Edward had turned into the silence that condemned him. Behind closed doors, the CFO muttered what many were thinking: we didn't just lose an executive, we lost credibility. And they had, publicly, globally, irreversibly. In less than a week, 3 investors withdrew their commitments. A European partner froze its contracts pending investigation. Stocks dropped 12% in 2 days. For a company that had once prided itself on stability, the fall was humiliating. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who demanded a black woman move had now moved the entire corporation into crisis. Meanwhile, Leona Harris said nothing. Her silence became the loudest headline of all. Every news anchor wanted her statement. Every podcast wanted her story. Every outlet wanted a quote they could twist into a soundbite. She ignored them all. PR strategists begged her to release a press note, to seize the narrative. But Leona understood something they didn't. Real power doesn't chase microphones. It lets truth speak for itself. While the world debated her tone, she focused on work. Linatech's phone lines stayed busy with new partnership requests from organizations wanting to align with her values. Her investors doubled down, confident that integrity had never been more valuable. Across social media, her silence became a case study in leadership. Commentators called it a masterclass in composure. Activists called it revolutionary restraint. Inside Orion, though, panic bred desperation. The interim CEO ordered a full audit of every division Edward had touched. The findings were worse than expected: financial irregularities, unauthorized contracts, even internal favoritism that had cost minority staff promotions. The dominoes fell fast. Senior managers resigned to pursue personal endeavors. Departments dissolved. Lawyers drafted non-disclosure agreements that no one wanted to sign. And still, Leona said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply carried herself with the same grace that had shattered a corporate empire. The reckoning spread beyond Orion. Industry conferences added last-minute panels on ethics and inclusion in leadership. Business schools rewrote case studies. Executives who once claimed racism was a social issue, not a corporate one, were now forced to confront the reality that bias had financial consequences. In private meetings, men who had never considered themselves part of the problem began questioning the culture they had defended in silence. It wasn't guilt, it was survival. One late afternoon, as news broke that Orion's board was under federal investigation for compliance negligence, a journalist cornered Leona in the lobby of her own headquarters. "Dr. Harris, any comment on the collapse of Orion?" She paused, offering the faintest smile. "No collapse," she said softly. "Just accountability." That line spread just as fast as the original clip. By the week's end, Edward Langston's name had become a warning in corporate circles. But Leona Harris? She had become a standard. And for the first time in Orion's long, privileged history, the men in that ivory tower finally realized the cost of underestimating the woman they tried to erase. By the second week, the story had left the corporate pages and spilled into living rooms, classrooms, and breakfast tables around the world. Morning shows opened with clips from the now viral recording, dissecting tone, posture, and silence. One anchor asked, "Was it really about a chair?" The other replied quietly, "It's never just about a chair." Major newspapers ran features titled, "The Power of Stillness: How One Woman Redefined Authority." Talk shows debated whether professionalism had protected or punished her. And on LinkedIn, entire networks of Black women shared their own versions of that moment. Different offices, same sentence. One post read, "They told me to move from the head of the table because the client wouldn't be comfortable. I moved, and I've hated myself for it since. Watching her stay seated healed something in me." Another said, "Every time they say I'm intimidating, I'll remember her calm. She didn't fight for the seat, she made it undeniable." Thousands of comments followed. Women who had been overlooked, dismissed, or labeled too ambitious finally found language for their exhaustion. Leona Harris had unknowingly opened a wound and started the healing. Within days, universities requested rights to include the case in their business ethics courses. Harvard, her alma mater, introduced a module titled Power Dynamics and Racial Bias in Leadership Spaces. Professors played the 58-second audio in classrooms to spark discussion on silence as resistance. Corporate America began shifting, reluctantly but visibly. 4 Fortune 100 companies updated their anti-bias and promotion review policies, requiring diversity officers to have final say on workplace grievances. Others introduced boardroom inclusion guidelines. For once, these weren't empty gestures. They were survival strategies for companies that had learned what one recorded sentence could cost them. At a global leadership summit in Geneva, a keynote speaker summarized it best. A seat became a symbol, and that symbol just changed how the world views power. Meanwhile, journalists tried relentlessly to get Leona's first exclusive. Networks offered 6-figure deals for interviews. Publishers sent contracts for memoirs. PR firms suggested documentaries. She declined them all. Instead, she focused on expanding Linatech systems. While others argued about what her moment meant, she turned it into motion. Her company announced a new initiative, Urban Rebuild, a project aimed at providing climate resilience tech for low-income communities. When asked by a reporter if this was her way of rebranding after the controversy, she smiled faintly. "I'm not rebranding," she said. "I'm rebuilding what I always came to do." That single quote was retweeted hundreds of thousands of times, not because it was fiery, but because it was real. Her restraint confused those addicted to spectacle. They expected outrage or revenge. What they got instead was grace. Behind the scenes, her quiet strength became the template for change. Black executives across industries cited her as a reason to negotiate better, to hold their ground, to expect accountability. Women began asking for their rightful titles, their seats, their space. And while she never spoke publicly about Edward Langston again, his name became shorthand for entitlement unchecked. "Don't pull a Langston," a viral tweet joked, when someone's earned their chair. But beyond the humor, something deeper had shifted. For decades, conversations about race and gender in leadership were framed as diversity goals, checklists, and training sessions. Leona's silence had turned it into something else. A confrontation with the truth that equality isn't granted by policy, it's enforced by presence. In boardrooms across America, executives started glancing around the table differently. They began asking, who's missing? Not out of guilt, but out of awareness. And through it all, Leona remained composed, untouched by fame, untouched by frenzy. Her story belonged to the public now, but her purpose hadn't changed. Each morning she arrived at her office before dawn, coffee in hand, eyes steady on her screen. While the world was still arguing about her courage, she was already writing new code, designing the next phase of a company built on integrity. No victory speeches, no interviews, no revenge tours, just progress, steady and unstoppable. And though she never said it aloud, her actions spoke for her. The seat was never the prize. The legacy was. 3 weeks after the boardroom explosion, the press release came quietly, just 2 paragraphs long. Edward Langston resigns from Orion Group citing health reasons. No mention of investigations, no mention of the audits, no mention of the woman whose name had forced his downfall. The statement ended with the usual corporate phrases, "We thank him for his years of service." But everyone knew the truth. His career hadn't ended because of illness. It ended because the world had finally stopped protecting men like him. The city had moved on, as it always does. The hashtag slowed, the think pieces faded, and yet the impact lingered. In boardrooms, classrooms, and quiet conversations where people now chose their words more carefully. Leona Harris never spoke his name again. She received dozens of letters in the weeks that followed. Some from executives trying to save face, some from employees who'd stayed silent that day, apologizing for their inaction. A few from women who had faced the same humiliation and wanted to say thank you. One envelope bore a familiar logo, Orion Group Headquarters. Inside was a single sheet, a handwritten apology from the board chair. "We failed you. We failed ourselves." She read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer she never opened again. Apologies couldn't fix what the world had already witnessed. Instead of victory tours or televised interviews, Leona chose something smaller and greater. She returned to the neighborhood where she grew up. The same cracked sidewalks, the same corner store with fading paint, the same elementary school that still used outdated computers. Her car drew quiet stares as she stepped out, not in heels or a power suit, but in sneakers and a plain gray hoodie. She met with the school principal and handed over a proposal, funding for a new computer lab and full scholarships for 10 girls each year to study STEM. The program's name, the Denise Harris Fellowship, after her mother, the woman who once cleaned offices just like the one that had tried to belittle her daughter. When reporters later discovered the foundation, they tried to frame it as a PR gesture. But it wasn't. It was a continuation. A reminder that her success had never been about revenge, it was about restoration. That evening, Leona sat on the steps outside her old apartment building, watching kids race past with secondhand tablets in their hands. She smiled. Not the smile of triumph, but of peace. For years she had fought to be heard. Now her silence spoke louder than ever. Her assistant arrived just as the sky dimmed. "Your flight's in 2 hours," she said. Leona nodded, stood, and took one last look at the building that had raised her. Then she walked to the car, carrying only a leather briefcase and that same calm she'd carried into every room that doubted her. At the airport, she moved through security unnoticed, another traveler in a sea of faces. When she boarded, the flight attendant glanced at her ticket and smiled warmly. "Dr. Harris," she said, "we've prepared your seat." Leona paused for a moment before stepping forward. A simple gesture, a seat being offered, not taken. As she settled into first class, the hum of the engine filled the silence. She looked out the window, watching the city lights fade below. She wasn't leaving to escape, she was leaving to expand. The world had once told her to move, now it was making room. Power, she'd learned, doesn't shout, it endures. And somewhere above the clouds, where arrogance once sat unchallenged, dignity finally took its rightful seat. The morning was still, the kind of quiet that holds both peace and memory. Leona Harris stood in front of a modest headstone on the outskirts of Atlanta, her hand resting on a bouquet of white lilies. The air smelled faintly of rain, and somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled past. The headstone bore a simple engraving, "Thomas Harris, he believed in tomorrow." Leona knelt, brushing a bit of dirt from the carved letters. "You'd laugh at all this," she whispered. "Your daughter, trending on the internet for staying in her seat." She smiled faintly, but there was no pride in it, just understanding. "You always said people reveal themselves in how they treat you when they think you can't fight back. Turns out, you were right." She placed the lilies down gently and stared for a long moment at her reflection in the polished granite. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who had walked into that boardroom weeks ago. That woman had been cautious, measured in her movements, careful with her tone. The woman now standing before her had nothing left to prove. She spoke softly, not to the grave, but to the world that had been listening all along. "They told me to move, Daddy, and when I didn't, everything around them did." For years she had believed that silence was the safest way to survive in spaces that were never designed for her. But now she understood, silence wasn't safety. It was surrender. And she had stopped surrendering the moment she refused to leave that chair. The clip, the chaos, the headlines, none of it defined her. What defined her was what she built after. The schools, the scholarships, the quiet victories no one tweeted about. Her gaze lifted toward the horizon. "You told me power doesn't shout," she said. "You were right again. It just endures." She rose, smoothing the wrinkles from her coat, and looked out across the field. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying the soft sound of children's laughter from a nearby playground, echoes of the next generation she was helping rise. Before leaving, she placed one last thing on the headstone, her company's pin, engraved with the Linatech emblem. "For tomorrow," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked toward her car, the gravel crunching beneath her heels, every step a quiet declaration that dignity doesn't fade, it multiplies. He lost a career. She gained a cause. Her story wasn't one of revenge. It was about reclamation, the moment a black woman stopped asking for permission to belong. And now, it belongs to everyone who's ever been told to move when they had earned their place. What would you have done if you were Dr. Leona Harris? Have you ever been told to move when you belonged? Share your story below and tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your country, your truth. And if you believe silence should never be the end of any story, like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly and refuses to move.